chapter 16, and that's, I think, on page 74 of your Pew Bible. And Jesus said to his disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' And he answered, 'Well, 100 jugs of olive oil.' And he said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. And then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' And he replied, 'Well, 100 containers of wheat.' And he said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you to true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." Thus ends the reading of the Word. Keep that Bible open. Keep that Bible open on your lap. This parable, along with the parable of the rotten tenants, is the hardest of all to figure out and take to heart. But remembering that it is part of a larger body of work and doesn't stand all by itself may help us to take a look at where Luke is trying to lead the reader. First, what do we remember about Luke? Remember, he's writing the gospel looking backwards from beyond the year 70 of the Common Era, after the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the Jerusalem temple by the Romans. So he's looking back. So let's say that you're writing a book about Lloyd Sagen. How many of you know who he was? Okay. He was the pastor of this church for 17 years. Let's say that you are writing that book today, looking back 40 years, trying to remember the sermons that he preached. If you knew him, you might have a memory of a few. If you didn't know him personally, you would have to rely on what others said. If you knew him yourself, what you remembered would be influenced by your current context, who you are today. That's unavoidable. Luke is living in tense times when he writes this gospel. The relationship between the Jews that follow Jesus and the Jews that don't follow Jesus is unraveling, and there is hostility brewing between the two. The hostility worms its way into Luke's gospel. Second, I have read numerous sermons on this particular parable that we talked about today, listening to what other preachers had to say about it. And they were all really, really good, and they were all really, really helpful, but I needed something I returned to the flavor of Luke's gospel and this particular section of it. Now, with the Bible that you have in your hands, come on, don't be afraid. Turn to page 73. That's chapter 14. Go back to chapter 14 of the Gospel. Just the last two verses, and we're going to start from there, moving into chapter 16. I'd like you to go with me on a scriptural adventure. Could you please now look at verse 34 of chapter 14. You may be saying to yourselves that both Eddie and I preached on these passages last week from our respective pulpits, but please bear with me. We are on a contextual journey to try and understand the parable. At the close of Luke's chapter 14, Jesus is speaking to large crowds of people who are traveling with him. He is telling all of those who have ears to hear about the cost of discipleship. He is warning his followers that they need to know what they are getting into before they jump in. Otherwise, they may not be able to finish what it is they start. Luke's Jesus knows very well what the disciples of Jesus will face in the weeks ahead. He has tried to warn them what awaits him in Jerusalem, and in turn what awaits them. But they are still unprepared. Luke finishes chapter 14 with a verse about salt. Salt is good. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. They throw it away. Let anyone with ears to hear listen. Remembering that we are the salt of the earth, we are to ponder this saying and ponder it well. Immediately following this somewhat harsh question about salt losing its saltiness, Jesus tells three parables about how God seeks out and finds what is lost. He tells three parables about God being the magnificent finder, the magnificent restorer of all things lost, perhaps even saltiness. God seeks out the lost and won't give up until what is lost is found, perhaps even saltiness. That is when the celebrating begins. God gets so excited about the lost being found that God makes a party. Woohoo! Let's take a look at those who are hearing the three parables in Luke 15. It's right there in front of you. Who is present with Luke's Jesus when he's telling these parables? The characters listening are listed there in the very first sentence of chapter 15. Say it with me. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming here to listen to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So, Jesus' audience is a mixed audience of people who aren't sure what to make of him. It is a given that the two groups stand or sit apart from each other. The religious, the scribes, and the Pharisees stand away from the rest, lest they become unclean by proximity. And Jesus talks to all of them about God the shepherd, God who longs for his flock to be complete and will not leave the one lost sheep to its own devices, but will seek it out and find it and return it to the flock. Then Luke's Jesus describes God as a woman who seeks out a lost coin, rummaging around in every nook and cranny, scrounging on the floor in all of the dust and dirt until that coin is found, and with her hands blistered and cut and calloused from searching, she returns the coin to the company of the other 9 to make the collection complete. Then Luke's Jesus relates a very human story about God as a father who had 2 sons. the oldest son, knew his place in the family. He was the rightful heir to his father's property and essentially managed his father's affairs. He wasn't prepared when his brother, the younger, decided to leave the fold, to take off and do his own thing, to venture out on his own and experience the world. Think the two sons. Think the Pharisees and Jesus. Neither was the older brother prepared when his younger brother took his inheritance with him. The younger son experienced life in a way that he had never imagined, and it nearly destroyed him until he remembered the one who had given him life, his father. No matter what his motives for returning to his father, nevertheless he returned. We tend to judge the youngest son not for understanding the cost of the lifestyle that he wallowed in. We say to ourselves, well, he didn't make a plan. We say to ourselves, well, he didn't know what he was doing, what he was jumping into. We say to ourselves, he didn't know anything about making the money last. He just jumped in and lost everything. There's that word again. Lost. He lost everything, including himself. But when he came to himself and decided to return to his father didn't care why he returned. His father was overjoyed at having the one who was lost returned, restored. The one who was dead, alive again. But the older brother, the one who had been steadfast, who had managed his father's property diligently for years, was annoyed that stray son, that rogue son, was welcomed into the house of his father like some tax collector or other sinner. Grace is in the eye of the beholder. If we are jealous of the grace of God offered to all people, then we are not living in response to God's abundant grace. If some think that they are more deserving of God's grace than others, then they don't understand God. So, now we come to that troubling parable. That parable about the dishonest manager on the heels of these previous parables. The parables about people and about creatures and about things being lost and found, lost and restored. And Jesus now tells the Pharisees and the scribes and the tax collectors and the sinners this parable about a manager who for years has managed the property of his master. We aren't sure who Jesus is talking about. It may be that he's talking about the Pharisees and the scribes who have mediated the matters of God and managed God's property for years and God's people for years. Like Jesus is speaking of, or it could be Luke's Jesus just talking about himself, speaking to his disciples as well, and all who have ears to hear. Some are annoyed with his parables, and others are relieved with his parables. The story begins with a propertied individual who has so much that he needs a major domo. He needs a manager to oversee his property. Now it happened that someone came to this wealthy landowner with a complaint, grumbling about the manager wasting and scattering his property, dispersing his property, not managing it well. He was throwing it away, or he was giving it away, or he wasn't just paying attention to collecting what was the boss's due. If he is squandering it, I would tend to think he's giving it away. So let us pretend to look through the eyes of the Pharisees of this parable. Don't be insulted or put off by what I'm about to say. Remember, a parable is meant to turn our world upside down. I think that this parable may just be about Jesus himself in the eyes of the Pharisees. if we really pay attention to the story, this is a humbling story that ties in with the search for the lost. Jesus is giving away God's grace, God's mercy, and God's love. Jesus is squandering it on people who are not worthy of it. Jesus, in the eyes of the clerics and the Pharisees and the scribes, is spending God's property. What they believe is not his to spend or give away. It is rightfully theirs. Like the older son in the parable of the prodigal son, his father forgave the one who didn't deserve to be forgiven. What throws us off is the term applied to this individual, the dishonest manager, which in Greek is adikia, and it means unrighteous of heart or life or just wrong. This unrighteous manager goes to those who are indebted to the master for more than they can afford and cuts their debt in half. But here's the parable at its heart. They still owe the master the full amount in truth. But the manager is giving the debtors a leg up. What this dishonest manager couldn't know is that the master would commend him for taking this action. Is Jesus teaching the Pharisees how to let go of their stiff-necked judgment of tax collectors and sinners? Is Jesus trying to teach the Pharisees to let them have a taste of God's grace? In the story, we don't know if the manager kept his job, but in the eyes of his master, he has done something good for someone else. He has been clever, easing the burden of the debtors. He has been shrewd in his dealings with the children of this age. In the eyes of the Pharisees and the tax collectors and the sinners, they can never make up for the way they live. Those tax collectors and sinners have lived dishonest lives. But Jesus wants those tax collectors and sinners to understand that God is looking for them. God is searching for them, not to make them as righteous as the Pharisees and the scribes, but looking for them as they are, who they are, to love them, to embrace them, to be merciful to them, to relieve their indebtedness. By whatever means necessary, Jesus wants everyone to know that God is at hand. God wants to be a part of the life of every debtor. God wants to be a friend to every debtor, no matter how much they owe. Luke's Jesus is telling all who have ears to hear, make friends for yourselves, even if you have to fudge on the bill, so that when worldly wealth and possession are gone, you may be welcomed into the eternal homes. The youngest son in the story of the prodigal squandered his worldly wealth and didn't manage to make any friends doing it. The dishonest manager in this parable actually did something for the debtors. There's nothing in the parable that says the dishonest manager lined his own pockets with the money that was owed to the boss. It says he was a poor accountant. He didn't keep tabs on what was owed the boss. He let people get away with not paying their full debt. He let people get away with not paying at all. Now he goes out and asks them to pay half. We can all learn something from this parable. The stiff-necked Pharisees and scribes who see the tax collectors and the sinners as debtors who will never be embraced by God have to listen to Jesus tell them that God actually cares about them and is looking for them. They aren't able to see that in their judgment of the lost, they have in fact joined the ranks of the lost. Jesus may be squandering God's wealth, but he is doing so to bring all those who are indebted to God, all those who are indebted to the boss, into a right and better relationship with God. Do you think the debtors care where the order to forgive half the debt came from? No. They only know that the wealthy manager has given them a break, and they will be forever grateful. kindness and his willingness to give them a break. That is who God is. Jesus wants everyone who has ears to hear to understand that we are all indebted to God. We owe everything to God. Jesus is making friends of the lost using God's wealth of grace. Some might say he is squandering it, but God will commend him for his shrewdness.